One of the great innovations of our generation was developed under total secrecy. Even many of this company's own employees didn't know what was happening. Imagine the risk-free innovation that can happen in that environment. You can take big swings at new ideas because no one ever hears about what doesn't work. That was the iPhone. But what does that have to do with how new, potentially life-saving drugs are developed? Maybe more than you think. We're joined today by Hanu Tyagi, Assistant Professor of Business Administration at Geese College of Business. He has co-authored a working paper called Does Transparency Hinder Technological Novelty? Evidence from Large Pharmaceutical Firms. Hanu, is there a contrast to be drawn here between products developed in secret and how development works in a more transparent environment?
Thanks, Aaron. At the outset, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this working paper. And I'll start by a shout out to my co-authors, Professor Rachna Shah at University of Minnesota and Professor Manuel Hermosia at Johns Hopkins University. And yeah, iPhone and pharma are different in many ways. Unlike an electronic product, pharma drugs come to market via a highly structured process. Drugs undergo clinical trials where their safety and efficacy are evaluated. If a trial fails, that is, a drug is found to be not that safe or not that effective, we as society, and by society I mean physicians, patients, payers, insurance companies, need to know about the failure because of the public health implications. Now, this is different than any other product where we as society maybe are not as interested to know behind the scenes story to know if an iPhone variant failed in the new product development tests, right? So therefore, while it is okay for some industries to be secretive about their new products, it might not be okay for pharma firms to be secretive about their new product development process.
Okay, let's set the scene. Historically, new drug development had been a pretty secretive process, but back in 2005, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors made a huge decision. This group includes the largest medical journals in the world: New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, Journal of the American Medical Association, all the major players. They basically said, hey, if you want to publish your clinical trials in our journals, you have to register those trials and make all that data public. Talk about a huge transparency shock. Before this, you had a file drawer problem where companies could just sort of sweep their negative or questionable findings under the rug. In this paper, you use the example of Paxil. Tell us about that case.
Yeah, so Paxil is arguably the poster child for the lack of transparency in clinical trials. Paxil was approved as an antidepressant by FDA in 1992. And circa 2003, FDA was already investigating the role of Paxil associated with an increased teenage suicide risk. An year later, GSK, the drug manufacturer, was alleged to know about the risks of suicides from their clinical trials in a very dramatic way, where an email from GSK got leaked onto the internet and the entire media caught on to it. In 2012, GSK pleaded guilty, paid a hefty $3 billion fine in a case brought by New York State Attorney General. Paxil remains to be one of the poster child and one of the examples, but pharma firms are often very secretive about the drug development process in general, sweeping their negative results under the rug. That's what we call a file drawer problem in this paper.
In this study, you wanted to find out if the drugs that get developed become less groundbreaking or less novel. And to do this, you looked at more than 9,700 clinical trials, and you used a metric called prior deployments. Explain what that is.
So before we get to the metric itself, the interesting aspect of this study is how does even one measure novelty, right? So we ask ourselves, what is novelty? And, before this talk, I was looking up Oxford Dictionary, and it defines novelty as the quality of being new, original, or unusual. Now, researchers have used a lot of ways to measure novelty, for example, using patent data to measure novelty. But we wanted to develop a measure that can be really used at a most granular project level, which means clinical trial level novelty. Can we measure it at that level? Enter prior deployments. We noticed that clinical trials often use a technology. So when I say a technology, think of COVID vaccine and mRNA technology. Think of an antacid pill that you might have popped at any time. That technology is called proton pump inhibitor technology. So there are technologies associated with drugs and drugs associated with clinical trials. So prior deployment as a metric basically captures the number of times a technology used in a trial has been used in the past. So let's say this count is zero. That would mean that the trial is using a technology that's being used for the very first time across industry. Now that makes it super novel. A higher count of prior deployment would indicate lower novelty. So that's the measure right there.
So basically, it tells us how novel a technology is. Is this a brand new approach, or has it been used many times before? It's like comparing a tried and true recipe to inventing a completely new dish. The more you venture into uncharted culinary territory, the higher chance of creating something spectacular, but also the greater chance of a flop.
Yep, I absolutely love this analogy. Thank you for this analogy. However, a more precise analogy would be tried and tested ingredients to create a new recipe versus a chef working to create a completely new set of ingredients to create a dish. That's what we're trying to measure when we think about prior deployments.
So what you found was a significant link between increased transparency and a decrease in the novelty of new drugs, specifically a 13.9% increase in prior deployments, which essentially means more companies were playing it safe, sticking to more familiar territory, instead of taking those big swings on new ideas and new technologies. And they were falling years behind the innovation curve.
Yep, absolutely. So first, it might be interesting to delineate why firms shy away from novel R&D in presence of transparency, right? And this is because transparency has the unique capability to bring out potential failures out in the open. So if you fail and the context is more transparent than ever before, everyone can see that firms fail. And it might have negative repercussions on firms' stock price, future demand of the drug, so on and so forth, right? So researchers have often referred to this idea as risk aversion, where firms become more risk averse and so they choose to experiment with more tried and tested technologies. So to put a number on it, 13.9% increase in prior deployments. We wanted to put this number into perspective. So Manuel, my co-author, came up with this very interesting way to do just that. What we do is we first measure a typical increase in prior deployments per year without transparency, and then compare that number with 13.9% increase. And what we find is 13.9% increase in prior deployment is equivalent to falling behind the technological frontier approximately by 2.2 years. And that puts that number into perspective. It's a whole lot of lag for a pharma firm when it comes to enhanced transparency, which is generally thought to be a good thing. But here are firms paying negative price for that enhanced transparency.
But companies weren't completely abandoning innovation. They're shifting their strategy toward what you call exploitation. Higher transparency pushes them to focus more on building on what they already know, but they also did keep swinging for the fences on some new approaches. How do we reconcile those two differences?
Yeah, great question, Aaron. So traditionally, novelty has been thought of as a mix of exploration, which is pursuing new technologies that haven't been used before, and exploitation, which is reusing old technologies again. If you think about it, these two approaches are pretty independent to each other. A firm could increase their exploitation efforts without really changing their exploration efforts. And that's exactly what we find. So the impact of transparency isn't as bad as we previously thought because here, because of increased transparency, firms are increasing exploitation, but they aren't reducing exploration, which bodes well for everyone, but specifically patients who are looking for those breakthrough drugs coming out of the pharmaceutical pipelines.
So basically, they're making small improvements to technologies that have already been proven. It's definitely less risky, but also less exciting. Now, there's another layer to this. This transparency shock didn't affect all companies the same way. What did you find there?
Yeah, and this was our aha moment, Aaron. So recall that firms are more risk averse because they are more worried about potential failures because of transparency. Let's compare two firms. Firm A has 5 trials and all of them rely on a different technology. Firm B has 5 trials and all of them rely on a single technology. Now, let's say each firm sees a trial failure Each firm sees one trial that fails in firm A and firm B. So then firm B, where all trials rely on the same technology, would be affected way more than firm A because their technology portfolio is diversified, right? In other words, negative news about a trial failure spoil the market sentiments much more strongly if the firm is a single trick pony or if the firm is specialized into one technology. Hence, firms with large diversified portfolios are well shielded, which is bad news because transparency is affecting the Davids of the world more than the Goliaths of the world. But also, this result isn't that bad because it hints at the fact that managers could use diversification as a managerial tool as a shield against transparency shocks.
So it's like the analogy of having all your eggs in one basket. Diversification is like having multiple baskets. If you're a big pharmaceutical company that invests a ton of money in a single cutting-edge technology and suddenly a couple of those trials didn't go as planned, well, it's all public now and investors might start getting nervous. But if you're diversified, those public setbacks are less likely to cause a complete meltdown. It spreads out your risk. And this is where the smaller biotech companies come in. They're often built around a single innovative technology. They're willing to take bigger risks, but they also have more to lose in these high transparency environments. So big pharma companies are partnering with these smaller players to get in on that early stage innovation.
Right, precisely right. Small pharma companies are a lifeline of pharmaceutical industry in more ways than one. COVID is a great example where if you see the originator of the COVID vaccine was BioNTech, a rather unheard firm before the vaccine. And Pfizer later came on, gobbled it up to bring their innovation to the market.
It's really a win-win situation. Big pharma gets access to cutting-edge research and smaller biotechs get the resources and support they need to actually bring their innovations to market. It really paints an interesting picture of how the industry is adapting. But what does this all mean for the future of medicine? What's the important takeaway here?
Yeah, so transparency sort of shocks this symbiotic win-win relationship, so to speak, where it lopsidedly starts affecting these specialized firms that, by the way, may or may not be small, right? If specialized firms were to shy away from experimenting novel drugs, it doesn't bode well for the overall innovation in the pharmaceutical industry, especially given the fact that a sizable proportion of drugs that come to the market are often developed, at least in the nascent stages, by these specialized laboratories. And therefore, a word of caution that enhanced transparency, while it may seem prima facie to be a good thing for the entire pharmaceutical ecosystem, may have unintended consequences for the stakeholders.
On the one hand, this increased transparency is so crucial for ethical reasons, but it also might make companies less likely to take a gamble on those groundbreaking, potentially life-saving discoveries. It's an interesting tightrope that I know you'll keep watching. That was Hanu Tyagi, Assistant Professor of Business Administration at Geese College of Business. The paper is called Does Transparency Hinder Technological Novelty? Evidence from Large Pharmaceutical Firms. You can read more about research like this coming out of Geese College of Business at geesebusiness.illinois.edu.